Welcome back to Canadian Agriculture Unpacked, brought to you by Footprint. As usual, you will find the phone number and email address on your screen if you want to contact us. And in fact, if you want to invite yourself to this show, please do so, because if you have an issue that we've talked about that you would like to address, or if you have your own issue that you would like to bring to the table, please don't hesitate to do exactly that. I would like to welcome again our two guests, Wayne Easter and Jack Wilkinson. You know that their credentials are well noted in previous podcasts, and they're stellar. Wayne Easter, a former 28-year Member of Parliament, former Solicitor General of Canada, and Chair of the House of Commons Finance Committee for many years. Then, of course, Jack Wilkinson, who was the president of everything he touched. Jack was president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, president of the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, and president of the International Federation of Agricultural Producers, now known as World Farmers. Jack is currently on the board of Cooperators Insurance. Welcome another guest today, Satish Singh, the former policy guru for Turkey Farmers of Canada. You know, I've known Satish for quite some time. He started with Turkey Farmers of Canada shortly before I became chairman of that organization, and since then grew to become one of the best trade and ag policy technicians in the supply management group, better known as SM5. So welcome, Satish. Today we want to talk about the various bilateral and multilateral trade agreements executed by Canada over the last several years, starting actually in 2017 with the EU agreement. And we're going to do so within the context of how they impact our own agricultural commodity groups. We're going to focus on supply management today, although we know that trade negotiations and agreements, especially if they result in more profitable market access, are a high priority for our export commodities as well. Someone from an export commodity, in fact, told me once that we can't worry about import competition, we're free traders. And we will cover export commodities in subsequent podcasts. But that's enough for me. Before we go into the more technical discussion, I'd like to briefly review a little bit of supply management history. I do believe that supply management in Manitoba, that's where I lived at the time, started in 1969, and our federal legislation, the Products Act, started nationally in the early 70s, I believe. And Satish, you probably know that history better than I do, and you can comment on it. But Wayne, can you tell me when dairy made that move?
Well, there was move in the late 60s. I remember going to meetings in Charlottetown when it was talked about in probably 1969, 1970. The Canadian Dairy Commission, which is not supply management, the Canadian Dairy Commission was set up first in 1966, and supply management came into being in Quebec and Ontario they began implementing supply management in 1969, and then the other provinces followed. What brought it into the kind of national concept was when the Farm Products Marketing Agencies Act passed by legislation in the Parliament of Canada in 1971, and that brought all the provinces under kind of what you'd call implementing legislation for supply management, for dairy, for eggs, for chicken, and then eventually a couple others as well. But it was really designed to the pressure come on from the farm community because, number one, especially in the dairy industry, they were being gouged by processors, and you were getting the ups and the downs in the industry, and so there had to be a solution found, and the pressure come on, and supply management was implemented because of that. But first in Ontario and Quebec in 1969.
Okay, thanks for that, Wayne. Satish, the Turkey agency started in, was it 72?
No, the egg started in 72, turkey was 74, and chicken was 78.
Okay.
So I think Wayne's correct. The boom and bust cycle of agriculture kind of led to the supply management getting set up in the poultry and egg side. The other piece on it, though, and I think Wayne touched on it, is supply management allowed the farmers to collectively negotiate price with the processors. There were very few processors, and they had pretty much a monopoly, and they could work producers against one another. And I think that's the basis of supply management in the poultry sector. It allowed for that collective marketing. Imports were also an issue back then. They could just flow across the border, which didn't help producers get a return on their investment. And then I think the other piece on it is I recall seeing in the archives where the Canadian government used to have to help subsidize the export of these products. And again, that's not something the government liked to do then, and I still don't think they like to do it now. But so there was good reason and rationale for setting it up in back in the 70s.
I think the one point that for the non-farm people, it's not really well understood with supply management. A commodity that is a net importer, i.e. we're consuming more than we're producing on a yearly basis, could have made application at the time period to joint supply management. But what they give up for the ability to negotiate collectively in the industry is they give up the ability to effectively export. So what they're doing is they're making a decision as growers that we will discipline our production within the Canadian system so that we don't have surpluses that the government would have to deal with, and in return we get some border protection. Because the problem with agriculture produce in particular, it's perishable. And so if the U.S. has got a bit of surplus, they're going to dump that at maybe 25% of their cost of production just to get rid of it, because 25% is better than nothing. But if you're a farmer in Canada, you got to deal with that, because the first thing the processor says is, well, Jack, I can buy stuff over here for 25 cents on the dollar. I'm guessing I'm going to pay a little bit less for you. So that went on all the time in many perishable commodities. And if you look in Canada, those perishable commodities, generally speaking, have come together to create a system. It may not be exactly supply management. It might be the tender fruit in Ontario. It might be some other ones. But they knew if they did not organize themselves to deal with oversupply and negotiate with the processor, they eventually would be done. And they would be poverty stricken until you're done. So, but they give up that right for that export. So they've really chosen discipline in return for being able to negotiate a price that met their cost of production plus a return on labor in the barn. So a lot of people just don't understand what sacrifice was made then as well.
Well, you've all touched on the financial insecurity of these producers prior to supply management. I remember in '69, although I'm not sure how I remember this because I was practically a baby back then. But
Sure.
my father saying after we had shipped turkeys, saying that he had enough money to pay the feed bill, enough money to pay for the poults, and enough money to pay for the turkey loaders, and that was it. I also remember him commenting on the fact that when they held the farmer meetings to make a decision or to take a vote on whether we wanted supply management or not in Manitoba, some of the meetings almost resulted in fisticuffs between attendants because, of course, some didn't agree with it. So my question, and maybe Wayne, you will remember this if you were attending these meetings, did it include only the producers of that commodity? Did it include downstream and upstream industry people and even non-producing farmers?
Well, I think the meetings were public, so yes, in some cases, processors were there. At least they were in PEI, and it is. I mean, we would understand from the farm industry if you have a processor sitting over there in the chair that you're depending on shipping your milk to, and you stand up in the meeting to say that no, you want a system where you're not specifically tied to this processor or whatever, you're standing up in fear. Those were the way the meetings were, because that processor can say to you tomorrow, under the way the system was, can say to you tonight, the way that system was then, listen, buddy, I'm not taking your milk tomorrow. That was the reality of the system. So, yes, those meetings were very lively. There was a lot of angry words exchanged. And it took real leadership by the farm movement at the time to stand up to that pressure and say, we're going to implement a new system. And it took real leadership by the politicians as well, because they were getting a lot of pressure. I'd just like to sum up Jack's point. Basically, what the system allows is the farm community had to manage their production basically to meet domestic demand. And in return for that, a formula was set up where efficient producers, and that's an important word. The basis of payment is not that everybody in the system is going to make money. It's not the way it's set up. The formula is set up on it provides efficient producers with the opportunity to retain or to obtain a fair return on their labor and investment for what they produce. But keep in mind, it's efficient producers. If you're not efficient, you're going to be dropping out of the industry as normal. And then on the other side, it provides security of supply for consumers at reasonable prices. You're not gouging consumers either, and that isn't what's understood out there in the public arena, especially with some of the anti-supply management people on what they say about in the media.
Well,
And
I
to
think
build on Wayne's comment is just it also ensures that there are commercial value chains in each of the commodities, supply management commodities in each province. And so that economic activity is maintained and it spurs other economic activity in the provinces.
thanks for that,
Bob, may I
guys.
make a point?
But yeah, just let me make one comment, and Wayne, you were alluding to this. I mean, the governments have taken steps to make sure that we have oversight committees appointed by provincial governments and by the federal government to make sure that farmers don't take advantage of the pricing authority that they have. Go ahead, Jack.
One thing that I think is very interesting, when I was in the International Federation and traveling around, when you talk to farmers, Canada was and still is a world leader in genetics. So the dairy industry, probably well sought after. In the poultry industry as well, incredible genetic, laying hens, etc. And I always felt that really, I'm not in supply management, never have, so I'm not speaking on behalf of deep knowledge, it's what I've been told by people. My sense is the reason that we were able to invest in genetics was because we had a stable income. Farmers knew that their best thing, to Wayne's point about efficiency, those formulas, I think, depending on the commodity, it changed, but would be based on the top percentage of the producers when they did the cost, okay? So if you're at the bottom half, you could still keep producing milk, but you sure weren't making any money, and you decide what you're going to do in the future. But that ever-evolving pressure on efficiency, production, volume, really a lot came from genetics and better housing and better feeding and better management. And that came about in a lot of sense because you had a sense that if I buy better breeding stock, I can count on that investment. If I'm making money on my farm today and I've got a surplus, I'm going to reinvest in that farm. And I think that really made our genetics world renowned and world sought after. And that comes about when you have a sense of confidence that I'm still going to be in business tomorrow. So buying that particular dairy cow or whatever it might be is a good investment and I'll get a payback. And that affected our genetics worldwide as well. So these things are not thought of when you kind of take that one little snapshot. And it's amazing how it's just changed the whole industry.
Absolutely correct, Jack. Absolutely correct. Like as a producer, you had the security of income that now I can invest in better breeding to increase the production of my herd, et cetera, et cetera. I can put in a better system in terms of milking as well. That security of income is what made it possible for us to develop, especially the Holstein breed, as one of the best in the world. That's how we ended up exporting so much genetic breeding stock around the world, because we had the security of income on the one hand to give us, I guess, the courage to invest on the other side. Absolutely correct. A spin-off and a positive spin-off for the economy as a whole.
And that's the same thing in the turkey industry. Turkey Genetics, one of the top two breeding companies in the world, was developed right in Kitchener, Ontario.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. So we now have a supply management industry that's worth at the farm gate about 4.1 billion for chicken, close to 500 million for turkey, eggs at about 2.5 billion, and dairy at almost 9 billion. Of course, that's farm gate value only. If you look at downstream, it's worth even more. I believe in a supply management circular, they say that the industry is worth 30 billion to the Canadian GDP. Incidentally, hogs are worth about 4 billion at the farm gate, and beef cattle and calves around 15 billion. You know, Eugene Whalen, in his book Whalen, incidentally, I have a copy of that. I was in a used bookstore the other day and found a hard copy of Whalen's book, and there's some interesting excerpts in it. Eugene Whalen seemed to be upset. He takes credit, of course, for poultry and dairy supply management nationally, but he seems upset because he was desperately trying to get the cattle industry to go to supply management as well. Can you gentlemen comment on why did more commodities not go that route? Satish, I'll start with you. What do you think?
You got to remember, back in the 1970s, so we're looking at the 1970s, you look at red meat, you look at beef and pork, they represented over 70% of per capita consumption of meat, right? So, and they didn't export much. I think beef exported 3%, pork maybe 5%, and now they're like 50 and 60% of their production is exported. I don't think there was a critical need for them. I think they saw going into supply management would curtail their ability to grow in the domestic market. But what changed is economics. The economics of producing eggs and poultry relative to red meats is vastly superior because of the feed conversion, which then drove, I think, the growth in the poultry sector, which therefore meant that the red meats had to export. So I think if you go back in time, I don't think they saw a need for it because they were the king of the hill at the time, and they didn't think they needed it.
And I think, Bob, as well, it's, I think to Wayne's point earlier, we can't underestimate how difficult it was to get supply management in the commodities we've just talked about. It was a very aggressive street fight for sure. And so these things were not overwhelmingly supported. They were supported in the end because of the terrible net income at the time period of those farm families, and people were going bankrupt like flies. So when things were that bad off, you have to make a change, and this seemed like by far the most logical step forward. But, you know, it was based, the big numbers were based in Eastern Canada because, I mean, they were supplying population. So whatever provinces had big populations, they had a matching commodities and supply management size. Whereas the West, which is at the time period, in particular on cattle, you know, the vast majority of cattle production was in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, Manitoba. All provinces had some, but those were the big ones. And they had a cultural attitude of independence, export-oriented, whether it was oil, whether it was agriculture, the grains, they grew way more grain. It was all, 90% of the Western grain was exported. So you had a culture on the farm family and in the prairies that was much more oriented towards export interests. There was a small number of farmers in those provinces that had supply managed. So I think that always has played a factor. That concept that we do not want to pull back, particularly with grain production and beef, to our domestic market. We see that as a negative impact on our farms. And so, but they all lobbied at the same time for farm income support. When they had bad years. So it was a different culture, and I think that was what kind of drove it. Whalen tried on numerous times, but I remember up until about 10 years ago, there were still often pushes in the downside of markets in Ontario to talk about supply management in both pork and beef. But by that time, a lot of people in hogs moved from family farms to contract production for processors. So once it got to that business model, kind of the conversation about free, independent family farms had also changed dramatically. So, we're a different snapshot, a different culture, a different market, as has been said, and different decisions were made.
Just to add to that, I think is the collective marketing piece. So supply management was collective marketing, but for wheat, your collective marketing was the wheat board,
Yep.
right? So there are similarities there, and the other piece on it is you have to look. People fail to realize that supply management, at its core, is also a risk management tool. And I think, as Jack was mentioning, the non-supply managed commodities had different risk management tools, and today they have evolved risk management programs in place.
That's a great point, Satish. Let's leave history then for the moment, except to say that we know that up to 94, supply management had Article 11 to control the Canadian border. In the last GATT agreement, we lost Article 11, but we're supposed to get similar protection through TRQs and high enough over quota tariffs so that products wouldn't spill over the top. And so now basically everybody's in the same boat. Supply management and exporters, we're working with a tariff regime, and so the tariffs that supply management has and the TRQs were to protect it at the WTO. However, there hasn't been a new GATT/WTO agreement since the last one, which was in '94. But Canada has been very busy negotiating bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. Now, given that both supply management and exporters are under a tariff regime, why do you suppose there is still that tension between exporters and supply management, or even other industries? I met with a member of parliament shortly after CUSMA was agreed to, and she said, look, we used to be sacrificed for supply management. It was time that supply management was sacrificed for the auto industry. So why is there still that tension? Yes, I asked, given that supply management and exporters are now under basically the same tariff regime, why is there still that tension between agriculture exporters and even other industries and supply management? In fact, shortly after CUSMA was agreed to, I met with a member of parliament from an auto manufacturing constituency. She told me that, well, yeah, so supply management got sacrificed for the auto industry, but till now, the auto industry was sacrificed for supply management. Who wants to go first? Wayne, you should, because you were a member of
I think,
parliament.
I can go first because I've heard lots of those arguments while I was a member of parliament, and there is the mistaken belief that there's trade-offs, and sometimes there may be a little bit of a trade-off when you're into negotiations. There's this industry and there's that industry. But I think from a government perspective, you're trying to get the best for all industries. And I think your explanation on the tariffs regimes that are there now, Bob, is right. And it should be seen in that light, that you're not building one industry at the expense of the other. But to get over that belief is going to be really, really difficult because it's a set in belief out there now that because supply management has some protections, that it is protected at the expense of somebody else in a trade negotiation. It's not true, but it is a belief that out there, and sometimes and perception is in many cases reality. So it's a real problem, and it becomes a I think it becomes a communication issue for us in the supply management industries to explain that. And then the other thing you have, I mean, you have big media in this country, and some people that are fairly adequate at using the media that like to attack supply management because they think it causes high prices, which it doesn't. It causes uh, fairly regular prices, no ups and downs. And that's a benefit to consumers and farmers. But there are those that will attack it on that basis, and that's how you get to where we are.
We're all in agreement about this lack of understanding of other sectors. And when you're part and parcel of talking to trade negotiators all the time, as we were when we moved from the General Agreement of Tariff and Trade to World Trade Organization rules, the farm community, in particular, Supply Management and the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, International Federation, were extremely involved in negotiations and giving advice to negotiators, to the point that all of us can remember when the Canadian group was over in Geneva or Brussels or wherever meetings were being held. We would meet with the Canadian trade negotiators every night after negotiations were over to find out what went on, what were the issues they needed information on, and how could we help. And so there was a deep, deep, deep understanding of what was going on, which I think is rare in today's circumstances, of that degree of collaboration. And that collaboration and the fact that supply management staff, and there was one right here, were so well equipped with information to the point where I knew of individuals that were getting called very late at night to give us some tariff numbers on a particular subsection of your production because they had to table things, and they were ready, and they gave those numbers. So that meant, they really helped the negotiators with the questions they had about those commodities. And I think that helped them be more successful because of that. And why wouldn't it? So that's just kind of the way life goes on sometimes. But this sense that, there's just still is not a very common understanding of what does agriculture need to be successful versus segments of agriculture. And that's what we should concentrate on. And for all of us, work on educating of the consuming population and members of Parliament at large are critically important. When you get down to less than 2% of the population producing food, and hardly nobody other than farmers living in rural areas of substance, we really have an uneducated urban population. And when you put in immigration on top of that, so many people coming from countries that have never even heard the word supply management, they're very vulnerable to the conversation like Wayne talks about. The head of the restaurant industry blaming a glass of milk price on supply management when the milk's probably cheaper than the Pepsi, for God's sakes. There is just so little information. It really is appalling. But all you can do is understand that's the way it is, work in a sophisticated manner to educate, and continue to lobby. And if you're a farmer, that's part of your job description for the rest of your life. It's not going to be over next year or the next round of negotiations. It just goes on and on and on, and that is just the way it is. That's why we have organizations. So you can burn old farts like us out. We retire and some young person starts at the bottom and takes over our place.
There you go. Before I go to you, Satish, and I'll let you answer the same question, but do you think that something like Bill C-282 adds to that attention? I think we all know what Bill C-282 is. Satish, you want to talk about the tension and how Bill C-282 adds to the dynamics?
I think the tension is more between farm organizations than farmers. So let's take turkey. 50% of our turkey farmers in Canada have non-supply managed commodities. supply management on their farms is part of their risk management tool. So if they're not, if international prices aren't good on their crops, they have supply management to fall back on. And when they fall back on that, they don't fall back on government risk management tools like agri-stability. Okay. So I think at the farm level, it's a different view across the fence line than at national organizations. The other point I think I should make here is, Bob, you kind of said all the commodities are on the same footing, with tariffs. But that's not actually correct. You have to remember that for the non-supply management sector in Canada, I think the government of Canada spent $4.5 billion on support in 2020. Internationally, governments spend, I think, close to $600 billion supporting agriculture. So to say that it's a level playing field just because we're all on the same tariff basis isn't really correct. The non-supply management groups do get other support. So then on 282, Bill 282 is to prevent the slow erosion of import controls for supply management. Again, that's the access and the overquoted tariffs. It doesn't mean that supply management isn't off the negotiating table. You have other issues such as in-quota tariffs, you have rules of origin, you have SPS issues. So there's other things that can be negotiated that impact not just all of agriculture, or just supply management, but all of agriculture. So I think, Bob, what I'm trying to get at is negotiations are much more complex than people realize. And agriculture is a couple percentage points of all the tariff lines that have been negotiated in large agreements. I think the other thing is, and then back to domestic support, is bilaterals. Anything that's outside the WTO doesn't hit on the main factor that's affecting Canadian agriculture, which is subsidies by our competitors. And where the negotiations need to be focused on is on that and at the WTO.
Oh, you make some
Well,
very,
I
very
agree
good
with you
points
on
there.
that, but-
Thanks, Satish. Go ahead, Jack.
I totally agree with your statement that you can't resolve, and that's why so much pressure was on the World Trade Organization, because you just couldn't deal with the massive subsidization from Europe and US that was literally destroying world markets for grains and oilseeds and all sorts of production if you didn't have everybody in the room and all economic production on the table. To peel off agriculture and those two only, you weren't going to get the success you needed. So that was a big step forward, and it was a step forward because the fact that caps were put on how much export from those countries could be subsidized really drove the growth in ethanol industry in the United States. So all that surplus corn that had been dumped on world markets and destroyed Africa and Asia and every country's grain production, whether it was rice or whatever, now became ethanol. And that really changed the mindset. And in Europe, a lot of oil seeds, that oil went into biodiesel and ethanol. So those surpluses, and there was government money to do it, but those surpluses got off the world market. That allowed those commodities to come back to more a normal regional area cost of production, which allowed us to, in Canadian exports, to really see the light at the end of the tunnel. I remember when my wife and I moved up here, both of us had off-farm jobs just to subsidize our living standard and the farm in some years. You literally had a negative net income just on your inputs. That's how bad it was. So that change is critical. But the other point is we really, I think, put a nail in the coffin, and this is slightly off topic. When we reduced import and export duties in developing countries with no sense of what that would do to their economy, we effectively sealed the fact they would never come back to the table again. We forget those countries did not have income tax, they did not have sin taxes, they did have little in domestic industry, so all of their money was made effectively on export tariffs and import tariffs and duties. We told them that's a thing of the past, you should not do that, with no sense that would literally destroy their economies. Some people actually thought that Microsoft was going to move its chip plant to Uganda, for Christ's sakes. I mean, it was absurd, this expectation, if we just free this all up, all industry will nicely divide up the country and invest appropriately in every country, and they'll all have the water shall lift to the top in these life jobs. And so they just got destroyed. And they said, we will never trust a World Trade Organization negotiations again, because we were beaten up, had to sign, we signed, and our economies have collapsed. So we pretty much put a nail in our coffin, I think, for world trade discussions. And this bilateral is not to Canada's advantage ever. We're too small to win bilaterals. It's going to be tough.
All right, thanks,
And
gentlemen.
with that, I'd like to wish everybody a Merry Christmas before we...
Okay.
Thanks for that, gentlemen. We're going to go now to, but before we go to briefly look at the bilaterals and multilaterals that Canada has agreed to, one of the things that puzzles me a little bit is when people make the argument that other countries need food security, that's why we should have all the access we want into that country. Fact of the matter is, countries can import as much as they want, regardless of a trade agreement. And in fact, we do know that countries already have lower tariffs for some commodities than their bound tariffs. So how is it a food security issue in other countries? Why can we say we should have free trade so that other countries are more food secure? Anybody want to touch that?
Not an easy question to answer, Bob. But in terms of the food security side, I think as like a country looks at it, if we can produce it, if we have our own food supply within our own country of the basics, then we have greater food security. And there's economists will argue out there because one country can dump food into another and undermine the farmers' security within that country and undermine their prices, basically that they can't pay their bills, then that's going to affect that country's food security. I think that's how you get to that argument, and I think that's why you need basically a rules-based system that you're not undermining the prices of other countries. Yes, you want to be competitive. It has to be based on efficiency and so on, but there shouldn't be ways and means that you can directly undermine the ability of producers in another country to be able to survive.
All right.
Sometimes, Bob, people just make things up. To be frank, okay. And you gotta take this. You kind of have to look at this in levels. If you look at food insecurity internationally, 70% of it is due to of acute hunger is due to war, conflict. Okay, that's the bulk of it is due to that, and forcibly displaced people. So that isn't something free trade can fix. So put that aside. In terms of Canada, we look at, I think the supply management groups look at food security in terms of being able to produce what Canadians want, and so it's always there. So like I think on the supply management side, if you look at poultry, dairy, and eggs, it probably represents 60% of the protein that people consume from livestock. So it's significant. So to simply say we're going to throw open the borders on poultry, dairy, and eggs, you're risking a self-sufficiency issue in terms of food supply.
Okay, thanks for that,
I'd like
Satish.
to add as
I recall
well.
having breakfast, when I was in IFAP, having breakfast with a director from an African country who told me, he said, Bob, we have so much good arable land that's fallow with a couple of feet of topsoil. And he said, our production is limited only by our ability to get the product to market. And he said, if we have 1 or 2 monsoon rains, the roads wash out and our crops perish before they get to market. So food security is a multi-issue issue, if I may put it that way. Jack, go ahead.
Not only do we have a massive disruption of a food supply system due to war and refugees, and that host it's already suggested, you also have a world net income problem. You know, if you have no money, you have food insecurity, even if it's sitting over the stall beside you. And we've never even bothered talking about that in relationship to food security. We have countries where net income is so low that they cannot purchase food. We have in those countries often, if there's a good land base, subsistence farmers. And they'll at least grow enough with their plot of land to feed their family and relatives. They've got at least some food security, but they can't afford to buy any of the other. And then you move into the situation we're talking about. If you read the latest report from the Food and Agricultural Organization, we're still sitting at the level of about 50% of all food produced in the developing world is lost due to improper storage, improper refrigeration, improper infrastructure. In the developed world, 50% of the food is lost due to grading, spoiling in the fridge, restaurant meals that get thrown out. So it doesn't matter what country you're from, we're throwing over 50% of the food away. Now, so we can grow enough for the world to eat, no problem. Just stop those two things. But the problem is in a developing world, many governments do not look at agriculture as something they should invest in. So why do you not have proper refrigeration in these countries? Why do you not have, I remember being in Mali, and they literally were driving their cattle hundreds of kilometers to the processing plant. Well, driving beef cattle for a week and a half across the desert, what kind of condition do you think they're going to be in to make steaks out of? I mean, the infrastructure is appalling in these countries. So when we were dumping food into Africa and the price was next to zero for their farmers, the complaint around the UN was, you got to stop dumping, it's destroying our agriculture. When they stopped dumping and the price went up to a level that was totally acceptable, they said, well, we've not ever had the opportunity to build infrastructure, so therefore we can't grow food. Like, you can't have it on both sides. Many of these governments feel comfortable in living in their urban areas and forgetting about the rural capacity to both grow food for fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So part of it you can't solve by a domestic, which we're all saying, domestic food policy in Canada cannot solve world insecurity related issues. We need to be sensitive not to do anything that would hurt their markets, but they have got to have the wherewithal to start developing their own agriculture policy for their own country, and then they'll have something in which to feed their people and create jobs with. And we can never forget about that. We brag about the numbers in Canada of how many spin-off jobs we get. That's true. And other governments have got to start thinking the same way and utilizing their agriculture to their benefit.
Okay, thanks, Jack. Let's move on. So let's start with CETA in 2017. CETA provided access. Canada provided some access on cheese coming from the EU. They did reduce some of the beef and pork tariffs, and in talking to a CCA rep at the time, or a few years later, he said, well, our volumes haven't increased a lot, but the access that we maintained is more profitable. And of course, they still have some serious veterinarian equivalency issues, as they do with the UK, and we'll get into that a little later. What do you think the overall impact there was? Satish, it didn't touch on poultry, did it?
No, but when you use the word some access on cheese, it was close to 18,000 tons of access, is my understanding. Like it was significant access was giving up for the dairy industry in Canada. So it was a significant hit on Canadian dairy. And when you talk about veterinary equivalency, I think, Bob, you got to talk about it's, to be absolutely frank, it's artificial growth hormones in beef. And when I was really young, I remember someone saying the customer is always right. And so the other piece on it, as shrewd business people, you should do your best to accommodate the customer. If the customer doesn't want growth hormones in their beef, then maybe that's where you should focus. So, a couple of points on the CETA agreement. Everyone knew what was in the CETA agreement when it was signed. Everyone, my understanding is Canadian agriculture, the exporters understood what was required of them. So to come back now and say, well, we have issues, they certainly do, but I think everyone knew what the rules were when they were negotiating.
Bob, I would come in there. Satish is absolutely correct. There was very significant access given to European cheeses. And yes, some compensation. I think that was the time we provided compensation to the dairy industry. And that's helpful in the short term to the dairy producers, but in the long term, the cost when you are in a supply management system, as we explained earlier, and you're trying to meet production to meet domestic demand, if you allowed more European cheeses in, then that means there's going to be less domestic, less space for domestic demand for Canadian producers. So the Milk Management Committee is going to have to tighten up how much production Canadian producers can provide. So that's the impact. And on the other side of the coin, we really, although we were provided access to move beef, especially to the European markets, Satish is right. The Europeans have and if you're over in Europe on the ground, you would realize that they have a very strong dislike for production of cattle using hormones. And so if we're going to really supply that market, then it's going to have to come out of a beef slaughter plant where you can give the security that there's been no hormones fed to this beef in order to get into that market. So the access, although the access was there in words, it wasn't there in practice.
We do know that sanitary and phytosanitary issues have plagued us for quite some time. Years ago, whenever countries said, "Yeah, we'll provide market access," and then they applied sanitary and phytosanitary restrictions, not necessarily based on science, but of course that's always been Canada's position that they should be based on science. And we've had disputes in Europe because of that as well, Italy being a prime example. Let's go on to the CPTPP agreement. This is where it got a little rough for supply management, and Satish had to remind me. For me, it seems like yesterday when that agreement was negotiated, but Satish reminded me the other day that the phase-in period is done, or at least basically done. You want to tell us how it impacted on Turkey, Satish?
So, yeah, the TPP or CPTPP agreement, that resulted in a 71% increase in market access. It was significant. And being a smaller commodity, and the way the products that we import is our high valued products. And that's where our growth in the market is. So that 71% increase in market access, we estimated it basically took away any natural growth in the domestic industry for about 10 years. Because it's the value added side where our market had the potential to grow. So it was significant. It works out to a permanent production loss on farms about close to 5%. So it was significant. In the case of supply management, we have to find our way in the turkey industry. They're going to have to find a way through it. The other big piece, though, and this is where I think people don't realize, is in supply management, One, if you give up additional access, you have to reduce your domestic production. So you have an economic hit. But the other piece on it is you don't control when the imports come in. They could come in nicely over the course of the year, or they could all come in, or a good chunk of it could come in one period of the year. And if it comes in late in the year, it screws up the following year when you're setting your production limits, domestic production limits for the next year. And it can really, the timing of that stuff can really screw up the marketplace. And for Turkey, that's what they've been experiencing the last few years is, when's it going to come in? And is it even going to come in? Because the other piece on this is, in poultry, there's avian influenza. So when you cut back your domestic production to address the additional imports, and then you have avian influenza where you lose production, and then the country that was supposed to supply you the imports has avian influenza and can't export to your country, it's a double whammy. All of a sudden, the domestic market is now short. Prices go up, and you have politicians saying, "Why is the price for supply management goods going up?" Well, you negotiated a deal. It's not in the interest of the industry. So, I think, Bob, that I hope I covered the ground. There's probably more I could say, but that's kind of like the.
No, that's great,
quick and dirty
Satish.
of
I
it.
wanted to make a point. I mean, red meat certainly gained a significant advantage in the CPTPP when the U.S. pulled out, so that they don't have to compete in Japan or Vietnam or any of the other countries with the U.S. Was it an advantage to you that the U.S. pulled out, in that they still then only have 5% TRQ into Canada and cannot take part of the increased access in the CPTPP?
In one respect, not having a country that's right close to you and has significant turkey production, not having access to that agreement is helpful. But the examples I cited with avian influenza would have been the same whether the U.S. had signed it or not, because the U.S. also had avian influenza when we had it. So, and then also, again, when the production would flow in, you don't know if it's going to flow in early, evenly, or late. So I still think whether the U.S. was in or whether they're in or out, the actual implications to the domestic industry doesn't change.
Okay, Jack, I think you had something to say. Go ahead.
The conversation now about not being able to control, when product moves across the border in a timely manner has always been one of the fears moving from solid border protection under Article 11 to tariffs. That was always the fear of the industry. If someone chooses to pay that tariff and bring product in, they can still disrupt my domestic market. And that means disruption of a supply managed domestic market for a few weeks has a huge impact. And people don't seem to understand, because they choose not to think, in my view. They don't understand how high a tariff you need at the border to actually give real protection. Because if I want to get rid of a product in my market, and we see this in the open market all the time, you just dump product in there for a few months. You put somebody out of business who doesn't have deep pockets, and you now have their market. And I would argue that there are some importers that are strategically using imports to disrupt the Canadian domestic supply management market, more than, if you look at it on paper, you would think is even possible. But by able to bring it in at a peak time period, a time period of high prices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you really are giving a lot more influence to an outside actor than we should. And this is the unintended consequence or the intended consequences. I'm not sure whether people actually know that this is taking place and we're giving a tool to our trade competitors, or whether they just are so uneducated that they don't know. I'm not sure which is worse, but they're both bad from the impact that you as a producer have to deal with.
Well, you're absolutely right, Jack, and what makes it even more complicated or complex is that the company that's importing it in another country could be the same company that's exporting it from its origin. And in fact, we used to give the U.S. A hard time. You will recall, Jack, that they always complained that they had a trade deficit, and the biggest reason for their trade deficit, if not the only reason, was the fact that U.S. companies in other countries were shipping product into the U.S. It wasn't that other countries were actually doing it, but it was U.S. companies. Wayne, did you have a comment on CPTPP?
No, I think all the points have been made. There is I think even under the agreement, there is ways of causing some serious problems for your domestic industries under those trade agreements. I think that's the key point that has been made.
Okay, then with the 2026 review of CUSMA looming large, and even larger since the election in the U.S., did we gain anything from last CUSMA? I know we lost some, but did we gain anything? I mean, our exporters wanted some relief on the U.S. reinspection, which they refused to give up because their reinspection is basically owned by the unions, and they were not going to give it up, and so it did not thin the border. The other thing that happened, and Satish, you might be able to explain this better than I can. Canada, I think, for the first time ever, allowed their world exports in dairy to be regulated in a trilateral agreement.
I think you're correct in that that's what occurred, but I can't really comment anymore on the specifics of that. That's not kind of my area of expertise.
No, okay, I just, no, and I don't expect you to tell me how egregious it is, but I, as a former farmer, I certainly find it just made no sense to me, and that's actually what I told our trade negotiators at the time. Why would they ever do that? But Jack and Wayne, do you want to, well, I also want you to comment on this, Satish, but I'll go to Jack and Wayne first. Comment on the impact of CUSMA.
Well, I really don't think from my perspective that we gained really anything in the agriculture sector. I know I was on the phone with some of the negotiators there right down into the last hours, and I think at least from where I sat, it was to try and protect ourselves from losses, because there is really, really strong pressure on supply management. In fact, I think it was the last issue that was taken off the table, and that was right within the last couple hours of the negotiation. So I think we were concentrating more so in our sector of preventing losses within our system, and I think we basically ended up sitting where we were, not gaining and not really losing a hell of a lot.
Take this, Bob, as an example of kind of one major economic power being the middle of that trade agreement and two much smaller countries, trying to find an equal playing field where you actually do talk about how you can improve the situation for both consumers and producers and the industry on both sides of the borders, Mexico, Canada, and U.S. And I think it just becomes more problematic when you start talking in the framing the discussion how it has to be only beneficial to a U.S. business or consumer when we go into the next set of negotiations. You know, we're not in negotiations when you start from that premise. You, in fact, are really, as Wayne said, playing defensive all the time. You don't have the ability to even if it's an advantageous economic situation for a U.S. citizen, you know, that's not their mandate. Their mandate is to move jobs back to the United States, make the United States great again, and that means somehow punishing both your trade partners. I find it appalling that that's where we've moved to, but that's where we are. And so you have to figure out a way to manage it as best you can. And that's going to be very difficult. But it's going to be a lot of defensive. It sounds like, from my point of view, what I'm hearing between the federal government and the provinces, that they are taking it incredibly serious. They appear to be now working much more closely together. They appear to be looking at ways in which, if the tariff comes in, they will have a list of as appropriate and as effective counter tariffs in Canada as possible to make U.S. businesses hurt in those states that have influence with the federal government. That's what was done last time, and it was quite successful in comparison to what it could have been. And I think that they're taking that strategy again. Whether it'll be successful, I'm not sure. You know, it's very, very difficult when you spend your entire life trying to learn more every day and have every day's a learning day and understand things better, to kind of revert back to like, tariffs are wonderful, it's not going to hurt U.S. citizens at all, when you know factually that's not true. You know, you can't put a tariff on something and not have the price go up domestically. Just think of, I mean, $125 billion worth of oil going to the U.S. and somehow a tariff will have zero impact on a U.S. consumer? I mean, I don't even know how you sit down and have a discussion with somebody who believes that. So that's going to be a challenge, not to be naive and not to dismiss, but to be very strategically with the right political partners in the United States that you can talk to, that you can make an argument, and those individuals still have influence over the administration coming in and, you know, in the middle of January. And I really hope they're able to do that successfully.
I think Pierre Elliott Trudeau had it right. It's like a mouse sleeping with an elephant in these kind of negotiations, where you got that big economy versus Mexico and us. Simply put, a tariff on us is a tax on Americans. That's what it really amounts to. And even in our beef industry, where what I'm worried about in the beef industry in Canada is that, you know, two of the biggest our two biggest slaughter plants in Canada are big American companies. And it isn't just about Canadian beef. They could actually basically move to their own plants in the United States, which would really cause disruptions in our beef industry in Canada in terms of where do we move our products. So that's some of the other implications that I hope somebody in the government is looking at. But it sounds like they're building, and I've been talking to some of them, building a fairly united strategy. And I actually liked Doug Ford's words last night. Okay, let's cut off the hydroelectricity to the electricity to New York and Michigan and a couple other places. We shut that down for 24 hours. Would their lights come on instead of go out in terms of thinking?
This idea of tariffs, this idea of reshoring jobs, all this, it resonates because trade agreements people do not see themselves benefiting from it. They don't see themselves benefiting financially. And, you know, the minimum wage in the United States is $7.25 an hour. That's a national minimum wage. Like, so, you know, should there be talking about a North American minimum wage in order to make sure that that's it? I don't know, but there's that element of it. You look at in Canada when we've had the strikes at the ports, at rail. The people who are working in those jobs, they know the benefit of trade. They're the ones who are working every day. And yet there is pushback, significant pushback, when they go to renegotiate their collective agreements. So I think we think we're immune in Canada from what may be happening elsewhere. You can't think that way, and I think it's a bigger issue that industries across the world, but definitely in Canada, you really need to have to think these things through.
Thanks for that, Satish. I was going to go to you on impact of turkey. I mean, we did have a gain for our sugar industry in Alberta, but what was the impact on turkey, Satish, from CUSMA?
Of the CUSMA, was an increased potential 25% increase in access. So between CUSMA and TPP, we're close to 90, almost doubling our market access increase. So it, again, potentially significant. But there's always a lot of technical things that are happening that can make it worse or make it a little bit less painful as the time goes on.
Okay, very quickly then, let's go to one final one. That's the Canada-U.S. Trade Continuity Agreement. I mean, that happened after the U.K. pulled out of Europe. And it was in force until, well, probably still is in force because they started a bilateral negotiation in 2022, but in talking to a trade official in the federal government, the UK walked out of their last session. And I told them, well, in that case, you're probably doing your job if they walked out. So that one has been basically been suspended, and it wasn't. Talking about supply management versus exporters, it wasn't all supply management. The auto industry is in dispute. The cheese industry is in dispute. And as I said earlier, the meat sector, and Satish, I think, clarified that really well. The meat sector wanting veterinarian equivalency. So there's not too much to say on that unless someone has a burning issue on that.
Canada negotiated at WTO during the Uruguay round an SBS agreement, right? And there was a big trade-off. There was all kinds of trade-offs made to do the Uruguay round agreement. Supply management got hit. Article 11.2c got taken off. So the rules are there. You have to apply it. But you can't apply it because there's no dispute settlement. There's no appellate body anymore. So, I can't. The rules are there, but they can't be applied. I struggle with how there's some segments of Canada saying, well, we need to negotiate that again. No, you negotiated a bad agreement. It kind of sucks. So fix what you have and go back within the context of the original negotiation.
We effectively have a World Trade Organization agreement that nobody pays any attention to, and people unilaterally put a tariff on. We throw it on batteries coming out of China. Somebody throws it on somebody else. There's no mechanism to resolve these issues, and yet other people fall back and pretend in the negotiations they're doing something meaningful. But if you can't make the rules stick in what's there, what is the advantage? Because usually in an agreement negotiation, you're going to give something up. So why would you give anything up if you're not going to get a system that's disciplined and got authority and can implement when you're being taken advantage of? And that, I think, is the fundamental problem. We have people who are not trusting that these negotiations are anything but a downside, and I'm starting to feel that a little bit as well. But to move back to protectionism, people need to go to the library and take a history book out. That's the highway to hell as well. So we've got a problem where people aren't looking at the past to realize the problem we're trying to solve, and they're just taking pot shots at these agreements if it's in their advantage.
I'd add one other point, and that is the enforcement issue. Even when you do challenge things before the WTO, the process is such on the enforcement side that by the time you get the case solved, the damage has already been done, and that's a real problem in terms of future negotiations. At least at that level, there has to be an enforcement mechanism that works and doesn't destroy the industry while the case is going on, because that's been the experience in the past, and that leaves people with lack of confidence in agreements as well. But I want to underline the point that Jack made way back quite a while ago. Multilateral agreements are critical. That's what we really need. And then you get a fairer negotiations, because in this, like the mouse negotiating with the elephant, you're in trouble before you start.
Yeah, I want to use this time to clarify something that I said in our last episode. I mistakenly said that China had agreed to a dispute panel for the current canola issue, the anti-dump. And talking to trade officials, I found out, no, that isn't the case. It was actually on another issue between China and Canada. But I think it's already been noted that the dispute mechanism at the WTO is in disarray. We were hoping that it would be fixed under the Biden administration, and it didn't happen, and I don't think it's going to happen in the next 4 years. So the next WTO agreement is probably some time away. Anyway, just very quickly to review, we're currently still negotiating Mercosur. Ecuador, we were negotiating with India, that's been suspended. We're negotiating with Asian countries. That goal is agreement by 2025. And as I said earlier, the UK walked out of the last agreement, and that's been suspended. So very quickly to close us off, there are a lot of puzzling questions, I think, that come to mind when we talk about trade agreements, when we talk about exporters versus commodities that are creating a solid domestic industry. And you wonder, has there ever been a comprehensive economic analysis done on the benefit of trade agreements? We already talked about whether trade agreements benefit or help food security. The other interesting issue, I think, is when we do an agreement, let's take CPTPP for an example. If we have an agreement in CPTPP, let's say the U.S. had stayed in, and you calculate the impact of having to compete in Japan with pork and beef against the U.S., what would then be the net benefit? And I wonder if anybody ever does any kind of work like that, any kind of economic analysis on the trade agreements. They're important, absolutely. But have we seen any solid
Bob,
analysis? Go ahead.
So Bob, the thing is, you can have people do economic analysis on that sort of stuff. But there's 2 points I want to make. One is subsidies. How do you deal with subsidies? How do you define subsidies, and how do you measure their impact on the trade flows? The other is a key one right now for Canada is the exchange rate. An exchange rate at 70 cents gives us a significantly competitive advantage, whether it's at par, because everything's priced in U.S. I think most commodities are priced in U.S. currency. And again, that piece of it is also interesting now in terms of a tariff, because a tariff or increase in your exchange rate kind of has the same impact on the domestic suppliers. So right now we've got a nice little buffer at 70 cents, and depending with the interest rate cut, that may drop a little bit more. So I think, Bob, you ask a really good question, and you can do this type of analysis, and you can hold things constant. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure if the analysis is worth the money you're going to use to draft it.
Well, you make a good point. And I mean, we talked just before you go, Jack. We talked about domestic support in one of our episodes, and I mean the reality with domestic support, especially with a country like the U.S. where we basically have an open border. I mean, 75 cents of their dollar still come from government subsidies, and we've long made the argument that that's a competitiveness issue. We had a former president of the National Farmers Union the National Farm Bureau in the U.S. say that, well, their subsidies were their comparative advantage. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, subsidies definitely come in, and especially given the fact that our farm support is a fraction of what it is in other countries. Our farm support is a fraction of what we're even allowed inside our entitlements at the WTO.
An economic analysis, has been stated, is one subset of all the factors that influence agricultural product movement around the world. So you've got, as has been suggested, I mean, it's no magic that the European Union went to a single currency, a single phytosanitary set of rules. You add them all up, and that's the only way it allowed them to have internal trade. But even there, they totally ignored the deficits that they could create, which were totally against the rules, and a whole bunch of other things. So it's impossible. It's a good exercise, Bob, to understand a point in time. But that all has to be put in the context of what other support goes to that sector. I mean, anybody who knows about the U.S. system, I mean, the dredging of the Mississippi River, the Army Corps of Engineers, the list of things that goes on that delivers water free in a farm in one country, and someone else does all that infrastructure themselves. I mean, there's no comparison to what their cost of production will be. So to compare only the cost of the fruit at the other end is like missing 90% of the conversation. And then we all know that we're living in a world of geopolitical problems, and we're living in the world where climate dramatically changes. From 1 year we got a surplus of wheat production, 5 years later we got the lowest world stocks we've ever seen. You can't pencil that out. And so it becomes very, very difficult to everybody to agree on a set of rules. And right now we're living in the world where the United States does not agree with almost no international rules. And it's not just in agriculture. It can be all sorts of different international bodies they've chose to either withdraw from and said it doesn't apply to the U.S., whether it be accounting rules to banking rule. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So I think the sense is stepping back and asking the fundamental question, what are we trying to achieve here? And then how do we work to get there? And it's not just on agriculture production. It's the other pieces have got to come along with you, or you're just laying yourself bare.
I would agree with what Jack said 100%, Bob. But I guess what we're dealing with here is, we can have the law of the jungle, or we can have a system, some kind of rules-based system that at least provides some sense of fairness and equity. But it's going to be damn hard to get there, and it's going to be much harder to get there when the United States, which is the superpower of the world, which wants to use its influence for themselves in terms of their benefit, possibly at the cost of everyone else. And that's a problem. But what we really need is a rules-based system that works. Lots have been tried. I still think the WTO, a multilateral discussion where people sit down as relative equals, is the best way to eventually find that solution. But that is especially not going to be easy in these political times that we're in at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Wayne. You got the last word. I would like to thank all of you gentlemen for being on this show. I think we've had a great discussion. I'd like to thank the viewer and our listener for logging on. As I said earlier, you have a telephone number and email address. Please contact us if you would like to be on the show, or if you would like to talk about any other specific issue. Thanks again, gentlemen.
Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, good seeing you all again.